Good morning, everybody. I know it's a little brisk out there for this time of year, but for the record, it does tend to snow in Idaho at least once every month. And with cold thoughts in mind, we are in here studying God's Word, and I think of it this way, that we can warm up in each other's company and fellowship later on, and that we will warm our souls by the things that God has for us to know through His Scriptures. So we may be physically cold at times, but we can be spiritually warm anytime. Last week, we continued our Christian Living series by starting I guess what you might call a mini topic on commands. And I was not able to finish, and so we're going to continue the thought on commands. Last week, we looked at the definition of what a command is, that it's an exercise of authority, that somebody would issue orders, or i.e. commands, as an official exercise of their authority typically. And it's done with a degree of formality and impersonality, meaning that it applies no matter what. It's not optional. This is something that must be done. And we know that the word command occurs well over 600 times in the Bible. But we also discovered that there's more to it than just the word command. There are other action words, verbs, where you see in the Bible where it says to go here or to do this or that. Those are also, by definition, commands. We even saw in Genesis 1 verse 3 where God said, "Let there be light." That lit there is an emphasis to a command. Now in today's language, we might think of the song "Let It Be," and it's more in a passive sense. But in the Bible, when it says "lit there," this is an emphasis to a command. So it's not optional either. So we then, as part of our Christian Living theme, decided to go through the 10 Commandments. And the idea being is that it gives us a very broad idea, an overarching spectrum, if you will, of how we are to conduct our lives as Christians. And we made it through the first 4 commands last week. So, having no other gods before the Lord God, to not make any graven images and to worship those, not to take the words, the name of God in vain, not to take His name in vain. And we also discussed the Sabbath. And these were very specific to us and the God relationship, our relationship with God. These commands are how we conduct ourselves with relation to God. Today, we're going to continue on with the commands, and we're going to see relationships between us with each other, how we're to conduct ourselves. And so if you are following along, I would go to Exodus chapter 20. And I recommend reading this chapter on your own, and in particular the first 17 verses. For this morning, we're going to start with verse 12, where it reads there, "To honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." Depending on your relationships, particularly with your parents, this could be a rather easy or rather difficult command to keep. I don't know about every situation in this room, but perhaps there are some times where you find it difficult to honor your parents. Well, what does that really mean, to honor somebody? By definition in the Hebrew, in the ancient Hebrew here, the word honor is to be weighty or to be heavy, to be burdensome. So we are to be burdened with our parents. But it also means to glorify them, to hold them in high esteem, and treat them with great respect. So it can be tricky when we're dealing with real-life situations, perhaps when we have a disagreement with a parent or as a parent to a child even, and you expect better obedience from your children. But in this case, think about you as a child with your parents, if they're still around, or how there may have been some problem in the past if they're not. Well, we know in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 6, if you were to read the first several verses of Ephesians chapter 6, that we're to see that children, obey your parents. This is one of the first things that I think it's one of the first scriptures that our children were exposed to in Bible classes. I actually was quite pleased when they brought that one home. Yeah, that's a good one. Obey your parents. Now follows it up in verse 2 to say, honor thy father and mother. So we were also born and had parents of our own. So it's more than just the children obeying you. You're to obey your parents as well. Now, when we're dealing with these real-life situations, we need to understand that we are not to obey at all costs, in a sense. So, for example, in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, it says there to obey God rather than men. So we do need to make God first. In fact, that's why that first commandment, to have no other God but me, there's a reason that was the most important, and it's in order. It's the first one listed. But when it comes to honoring our parents, we should not do whatever they say if it interferes with God's will. We need to obey God first. We also know that when it comes time for marriage, that the parents do leave their parents to be one with their spouse. And this is a natural progression. That is the godly order of things. However, what happens when you do have strained relationships, and perhaps you've got a parent that reaches out to you and you're like, I just don't really feel like talking with them today. Just put them off or just ignore them. Maybe we don't talk at all. Maybe they've done something that you just like, this is just absolutely wrong and I want nothing to do with them. That happens on occasion. Maybe some days we just need a little space to ourselves, and having a few hours of separateness might be a healthy thing at times. But there is still the command to respect your parents. Well, there's also, I'll give you a real-life situation that comes from the Bible. You can read about this in Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 through 6. You can cross-reference Mark chapter 7, verses 11 through 13. But here, Jesus is warning of the Hebrews' clever ways of getting out of caring for their parents in their old age. Now, instead of giving money to their parents in their old age, they found a way to dedicate it to God. But in doing so, because they were very clever in the way they interpreted law and traditions, they would dedicate the money that should be going to their parents, they would dedicate it to God instead. But instead of actually giving it to God, there was a loophole. And so that the money may not necessarily be used for a religious purpose. And it was called the offering. And you may have heard of the term Corban, C-O-R-B-A-N. So in this case, we've got some rather surly children out there that their parents have born them, they have dedicated and sacrificed much of their life to raise them, and now the parents in their old age are not able to provide for themselves. And you've got these self-serving little children out there like, you know what? I want this money for myself. I don't want to honor my parents. I don't want to hold them in great esteem. I don't want to glorify them. I don't want to support them in their old age. This money is mine. And so we have this thing called the Corban, and we've worked in this loophole where we're dedicating the money to God, but we're just really going to use it for what we want. That's not the Christian spirit, is it? Now, I've seen many of you care for your parents at great cost, at great effort and length. And to that is commendable. That is most commendable in God's sight. That is the attitude that we should have. We should, yes, it's a burden. It is a weight. It is meant to be. And I hope that I raise my children so that when I am barely able to walk or do anything on my own, that perhaps I'll have a little support. Even if it is, Daddy, you really should use the walker. I'm not looking forward to that day, but I'm sure it's coming. And I say that with all earnestness too, because this is a real thing. This happens to all of us. And you think about it, when there is a promise here in this particular command, it is a transition between this is how we relate to God commands, those first 4 commands, to the remaining commands where this is how we relate to each other. But note, in this particular command, that there's a promise that the days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And Ephesians chapter 6, verse 3, I believe, echoes that same thing by noting that this is a promise. Now, certainly, there's the promised land, the promised land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. But you read this promise again in Ephesians 6. So perhaps this is also a more general promise that it is a good thing to honor our parents because things will work out better for us that way, as a general rule of thumb. I'll give you an example. Let's look at you can look at nations, you can look at individuals. Even though individuals aren't necessarily guaranteed a long and healthy life, as a general rule of thumb, if you honor your parents, things will go well for you. But look at the country of China, for example. I'm not a big fan of China. I'm not a fan at all. They have many flaws. But they do have a high reverence for their ancestors, for those that are before them, for their parents. And perhaps that particular idiom, if you will, that particular practice that they uphold has allowed them to survive for the thousands of years that they've been a nation. You can see this in ancient Rome too. There was part of what made Rome great is the fact that there was familial respect. They respected their elders, they respected their parents. So if you think about nations and societies, it is a general theme, a general pattern that one can see that if people within a society, and a society generally as a whole, if they respect their parents, there is success to be had from that. So, Jesus warned about the Corban. We need to think about our own situations and remember that this is something that God ordained and it is commanded. It's not optional. And I have seen many great examples among the people here, in particular, where you have honored your parents at great cost to yourself, and that is indeed commendable. The next one. The next command, thou shalt not kill. I'm reading from the King James Version here. You might see one that says, thou shalt not murder. Is there a difference? Yes, there is. In the original Hebrew language, the word here is indeed murder, and it does imply a premeditation, and it implies malintent. And really, that form of that particular word in the ancient Hebrew only occurs twice. And you can see the parallel to that in Deuteronomy chapter 5, where you see the commandments are again repeated just before they enter the promised land. So in this case, it's Deuteronomy 5, verse 17. There are different words. There is another word for kill in the Hebrew, and that word means to be put to death. So, murder is to kill somebody, it comes with premeditation and it comes with malice. Whereas the word for kill in the Hebrew means to be put to death. And you can see that there are times when it is necessary to be put to death in the Old Testament. For example, in Deuteronomy 13, verse 9, we see that idolaters were to be put to death. It's a capital punishment for a capital crime. And again, we see in the very second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. So those who worshiped those graven images were idolaters. They were not worshiping the one true God. And so in those days, that was punishable by death. In Genesis 9, verse 6, we see that murderers were to be put to death as well. So there are certain sins that in this day in the Old Testament law, it warranted the death sentence. So murder is a vicious, malicious death, and it's premeditated. And murder is always despicable in God's sight. And kill simply means to take a life, to take the life of another. It doesn't necessarily mean it's premeditated and with malice, but there are times when death may be taken, death may be warranted. We see in John, actually, let's back up. Let's see what the New Testament says a little bit. Because this does raise the question of, is it okay to kill as opposed to murder? And I think we've answered that question, that yes, there is a time. You might ask about all of the deaths that took place in the battles of the Old Testament. And remember that that is not murder by definition, but it is the taking of life. And in every one of those circumstances, God was leading his people so that Christ may come to this earth to save all. And he had to preserve his people. And in the cases where there were battles where people died, these battles were sanctioned by God, were they not? They were also, and oftentimes God did a lot of the work. Now he would make God's people do work as well. He'd make them go to the battle, but it was really God that won those battles for them. He not only sanctioned it, he authorized it, but he also carried out a lot of the judgment himself. It was God's judgment. So you might ask about all those battles in the Old Testament. That's not murder. So now we have the question, is it okay to take a life today? How do we deal with that ourselves? Romans chapter 13 is a good place to start. You can see in verse 4, and I encourage you to read the entire chapter in full context. I'm only going to hit a few highlights. We don't have time for an in-depth study. But in Romans 13, verse 4, we see that the authorities, so those are people who were in charge of others in society, they are to be, quote, ministers of God for good, not evil works. And also says there to bear not the sword in vain. And remember, we talked about the word vain last week. It's an empty, worthless word. So we don't take the Lord God's name in vain. We don't use his name in worthless, empty ways. We don't cuss, for example, using God's name. But here it says, bear not the sword in vain. That's not saying that the authorities are not to have a sword, that they're not to use it. It means don't bear it in vain. Don't use it for evil works. Do you remember John chapter 2? Remember the money changers at the temple and Jesus drove them out? What did he use? He used a whip. I don't know exactly how he used the whip, but I know he had a whip and he used it and he drove those money changers out. So there is a time and a place to use force, is there not? Just as we might correct our children, Jesus was correcting his, was he not? And then another one that gets brought up fairly often, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the authorities came to arrest Jesus, right after as he was being betrayed. And Peter had pulled out the sword, and he had struck at an individual by the name of Malchus and chopped off his ear. I do wonder about Malchus a little bit. I try to picture in my head, how did he swing the sword and get only his ear? Perhaps he might have ducked and then the sword came across. I don't know. But the point being, what did Jesus say? He said, "Put up thy sword in its place." Matthew 26, verse 52, you can see that. And it also says there, "They that take the sword shall perish with the sword." Interesting. Now, one thing that you should note about that particular account, you can find this in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's in every one of them. In fact, in Luke, the question was raised by those who were with him, "Shall we smite them with the sword?" And then one, i.e. Peter, took a sword and cut off an ear. So Jesus was not telling him, you should not have a sword, period. No. He had been carrying the sword around. Perhaps that's something that they would have carried for security. There would have been thieves and people out and about as they're traveling through the land preaching the gospel, and so perhaps they had that. Peter carried that for protection. Jesus didn't say, don't hold a sword, don't carry a sword. He said, put it back into its place, into its sheath. So there was a place for that sword. Of course, that was not the time, because Jesus needed to be arrested, and he needed to go to the cross to die for the sins of the world. So, and in fact, those accounts, you can see that in the following verses. Jesus had to fulfill the scriptures. He had to fulfill prophecy. He had to go to the cross. So certainly that was no time for there to be violence. He had to be arrested. It was God's will. Perhaps you also have two swords there. You have the authorities showing up. Certainly they would have been armed. And then you've got Peter with his sword. So you've got two different swords in these accounts. Perhaps there's another message here. Perhaps Jesus was trying to explain to Peter that we do need to obey the civil authorities, that we're not to resist lawful arrest. Now, I would say that there was a lot of evil that went into that particular arrest, things that were not lawful, but those authorities that were there were acting under the authority of the law. And so perhaps there was an added message there, not to resist the civil authorities. But then they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. So we see this is a warning certainly directed at Peter, but is it not also directed at everybody else too? Jesus did not teach violence. There are some religions out there that do, but Jesus never did. He never, even by his own example, when he was struck, he did not strike back. We see Satan in John chapter 8, verse 44. Satan is a murderer, and he was a murderer from the beginning. I'll even go further to say that even though there is a difference between murder and kill, and that it does appear from Scripture that the sword, that there is a time for force, that there is a time to fight, that the New Testament does indeed explain it more explicitly. It explains the original commandment here to not kill in a way that I think is easier for us today to understand. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21, it reads, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Rakah, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire." That word rakah, and I'm reading again King James Version, but that also, your translations may see the word fool there. So basically, if you tell your brother, hey, you're stupid, you're a fool, but it's stronger than the way we use that word today. It was a word of great contempt. So it was very, very severe. And then in the latter part where it says, but whoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire, that word for fool is also stronger than when we might use the word fool today. We might say, oh, that person's a fool, and we kind of say it a little bit lightly. This is different here. The original Greek word, this is expressive of the highest guilt, similar to what we would see with idolatry. And we discussed idolatry in the Old Testament. That was a capital offense, punishable by death. In other words, if you were to go, don't be like Cain. 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. Don't be like Cain. In fact, if you were in 1 John chapter 3, verse 15 says there that whoever hates his brother is a murderer. That's a high standard. So just being angry with somebody to the point of giving extreme contempt to them, to hate them to that point, that's the same as murder. The seeds in our head, we may not have committed the deed, but we've done it upstairs in our mind. So there is a high standard for us as Christians to meet when it comes to New Testament Christianity. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, we see the next command. Thou shalt not commit adultery. You can compare that to Deuteronomy 5:18. Now, like murder, the word murder in that particular form was only found in Exodus 20, verse 13, as well as that verse in Deuteronomy. Well, the same case here is for adultery. It only occurs a couple of times in the Old Testament in that particular form. And it was usually with reference to of a man with the wife of another. However, it includes women too. And if you go to Leviticus chapter 20, you can see that it's also a capital offense in the Old Testament. It was punishable by death. Matthew 5:32 for the New Testament reads as follows. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of unchastity, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her, that is divorced, committeth adultery. So, if you divorce your spouse, here it specifically and expressly states you can divorce for the cause of unchastity. And that if you were to marry somebody after divorcing for the wrong reason, then you're also committing adultery. And we see some parallel verses which essentially say the same thing as this. You can see that in Matthew 19, verse 9. You can see it in Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Mark chapter 10. We've been studying 1 Corinthians. We studied chapter 7, a little bit about the commitment of the husband and the wife. And we can also see that what separates, aside from adultery, what separates marriage? Death. So there are two things that are expressly stated in the New Testament that separate a person from marriage, and that is adultery and death. Romans chapter 7, verse 3. But what about that New Testament standard? Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Again, it's shedding a little bit more light on the original intent of these commands for us today. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her in his heart. It's the same situation. He who hateth his brother is a murderer. So if you lust after somebody else, that's the same level of sin. It's just as bad. Now, you may not see the same physical consequences upon this earth. So let's say you've thought about it but then didn't do it versus somebody who thought about it and then did do it. The person who did do it is probably going to see more earthly consequences. But as far as God's standard goes, you just have to think it, and that's just as bad. High standard. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 4 to 5, and chapter 7, verse 27. It says there that the end of those who continue in this way, the end is wormwood, death, hell. So keep in mind, and we discussed this a little bit last week, a lot of these commandments, a lot of these requirements seem onerous. They seem burdensome. Maybe we feel like we're kind of cornered and kind of maybe claustrophobic, like we just don't have the freedom to do what we want. But remember, just as you raise your child and you set rules for them, you're doing it for their best interest. God sets these requirements for our best interest. And he does so that we may be indeed truly spiritually free. Exodus 20, verse 15, our next commandment, thou shalt not steal. Again, we can see the parallel to that in Deuteronomy 5, verse 19. Now, we all should know what stealing is. Stealing is to take what is not yours without permission. Usually we just say, it's just taking something that's not yours. Well, actually, you can take something that's not yours as long as the other person gives you permission to take it. Maybe they say, I want it back. Maybe they say, I don't care if I have it back. But the whole thing about stealing is you're taking it without permission, and it's not yours. And it seems very clear-cut. Yeah, stealing's wrong. Well, really think about your lives. Think about, some people, they embezzle, and then they make it on the news, and that's a big deal. They really stole. But there's little stealings too, aren't there? You can, when it comes to writing, you can plagiarize. You can steal another person's words, even. Sometimes if I want to talk about something that I feel I'm a little, maybe there's a chance I'm plagiarizing, I might go and ask that person, is it okay to say this? Or maybe I'll give them recognition for coming up with it first before I say it. There's many different ways to steal. John chapter 10, verse 10, this is from the ESV, English Standard Version. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So we have Jesus speaking here. We see that thievery results in destruction, but that Jesus' purpose is quite the opposite. He came to give, and to give life, and to give so abundantly, not to take. So when we receive the commandments from God, when we receive commandments from Jesus, it's for our benefit, so that we may have spiritual life. Ephesians 4:28. Let the thief no longer steal. Remember we talked about that form, let there be, that's a command? Let the thief. That same rule is not just in the old ancient Hebrew, it's also in the ancient Greek. It also is a command by grammatical definition. So here it says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. We might talk about people and taking advantage of the system or of other people rather than putting forth the effort to work for themselves. That's another form of thievery, in a way, in a sense. It says here, let the thief no longer steal, but do some honest work. Never really thought of that way before, but it's true. It says it right there. Proverbs says it very clearly. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 2, treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. So let's practice righteousness. Let's stay away from death. Let's gain our treasures by doing honest work and not maybe taking advantage of somebody or the system. Yes, there are people who get away with stealing, both large and small. But stealing, though it often catches up with us in this life, sometimes not. Sometimes people do get away with it. But if it doesn't catch up with them in this life, it will certainly catch up in the next. I'm about out of time. I do have a couple of more commandments that we do need to get through. To bearing false witness, not to bear false witness, and not to covet. And after that, I would like to continue with thoughts on commands and our culture today, and how we interpret the scriptural text. So, if I might ask the men, I would perhaps like to have another Sunday to preach. I know it's going to bump Jeff at least out. I did chat with him for a moment briefly before services started. I think he's okay with it. It is very important to consider the commands of God and to understand what they really mean for how we conduct our lives today. And I hope that you will find this beneficial as we continue, that you will find a sense of spiritual freedom, that you won't find these onerous or overly burdensome, but you will find that life actually improves. Love between yourself and God and yourself and other people gets so much better, and it's exhilarating when you allow yourself to submit to God's will. Speaking of which, we now extend the invitation for anyone who may have a prayer need or wish to be immersed in the watery grave of baptism and to be risen as Christ rose on the third day in newness of life. Please, whatever your need may be, come forward as we stand and sing.